I know what you're thinking. Who's the guy with the tie? He is my coworker, Eddie, and he goes with me everywhere. So why would today be any different? I wanted to start off today to tell you a little bit about the first day I met Eddie, and it also happened to be the first day I started working in the death and dying industry. I was shadowing a hospice chaplain, and we were going to see a hospice patient. And when we arrived at the house, there was about 4 or 5 people that met us on the front lawn. And before we could say anything, they're like, "Please, do not tell our mother that she is dying. She would not be able to handle the situation." And Jim, the seasoned chaplain that he is, just reassured the family, and they let us proceed. And when we got into the house and we walked to the patient's room, and she said, "Please come in," and there were 2 chairs sitting besides the bed, and she goes, "Please have a seat, but before we start, I have a request to make. Please do not tell my children that I am dying." And I'm like, what have I gotten myself into? And then I saw Eddie. Yet, Eddie is often called by another name, poor thing. But throughout the years, it's not always been easy working with Eddie. But our mission has been the same, trying to convince people to have hard conversations about death and dying. But we have grown close over the 17 years working in the death and dying industry. We finish each other's sentences now, and I'm real happy to have him here with me today. If you knew you were dying, would you be like that family? Would you not want to talk about it? If you knew you were dying, would you be kinder? Would you love more deeply? Would you forgive quicker? Well, I have a secret to tell you. You are dying. We all are. Now, believe me, I was not in my youth daydreaming one day, desiring to work in the death and dying industry. I know it's hard for you to believe. I was a creative kid. I loved a good idea. I love chasing that idea and developing it into a story that evokes emotion, that inspires, but definitely gets me out of my head and opens the door to the world of creativity. Now, I never knew that my love for storytelling or creativity would lead me to such a hard and controversial subject like death and dying, but it absolutely did. And these stories, these real-life experiences, have brought me here in front of you today, because there's only one common denominator in this whole death and dying scenario. It's you and me. It's us. Now, I've been fortunate to meet people at their end of life, like this month, this week, and yes, even today. And you know that saying where if you want to know what's important in life, pay attention to small children and dogs? You know that saying? Well, I would totally add dying individuals to that short list, because they have been the greatest teachers in my life, about life. They've taught me how to be real and authentic and vulnerable. I recall working with a hospice patient one evening. We had asked for families and patients to come out, and if you wanted your story to be recorded, that we would do that. And so I was working with this patient one evening at our hospice care center, and he was telling me what a wonderful life he had had. And he was saying how grateful he was to have had the people in his life. And then he started talking about regrets and mistakes. I'm talking about huge regrets and huge mistakes. And there was this long pause, and I was young at the time, and I was so uncomfortable with the pause, so I just jumped in and I said, "Hey, I've had regrets. I've made mistakes. Everybody does." And before I knew it, he had grabbed my arm and looked me square in the eye and said, "What are you waiting for?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "That's not good enough. Fix it." We often forget that we are all on a limited timeline now, don't we? We often forget that time is limited. And when a dying individual is facing end of life, they really tell you what's important. Because when time is limited and death is imminent, they usually gravitate to the one thing that we're all called to do, and that's connect with each other. I'm talking about really connecting to the point that we're fully seen in all our imperfections. In a world that is absolutely pushing for disconnection, numbing out, avoiding the hard conversations, being anywhere except this moment, somehow along the way we lost the ability to realize what's important. And maybe it's because we don't have real conversations anymore. We Facebook, we text, we email, we message, always a barrier between us and real connection. Now, I know this well because I do it too. In this busy and crazy world that we live in, we rarely have a time to even collect our own thoughts. And when we do, we don't want to talk about death, especially our own. We often ignore the possibility of death until someone we love most is sick or injured or perhaps facing their own end of life. I have seen some beautiful things at end of life, things that have changed me in an instant. I have also seen some horrific things individuals face on the edge of death. And because of that, in my experience, I do believe I have found the secret to dying well in America. But nobody wants to talk about it, and nobody wants to plan for it. Right, Eddie? He knows. But don't worry, we're not alone in our struggle with these types of conversations. We in healthcare have a very difficult time telling the truth to our seriously ill patients. We don't want to walk into a room and say, there's nothing else we can do. In some cases, physicians working with seriously ill patients overestimate life expectancy by 500 times. Whoa, why do we do this? Because we don't want to take away hope? Really? Well, this is where you and I come into the picture. Because we plan for everything. We plan for college. We plan for marriage. We plan for a baby. We plan for retirement. None of us wake up one day and be like, I think I'm going to retire tomorrow. We don't do that. Do we? But we rarely plan for the end. Why don't we? Do you not think it's going to happen to you? Some of my friends like, oh, hey, I'm not sick. I'm not sick. I don't need that. Others say, well, isn't it the thing that's what the elderly are supposed to do? And my favorite, I'm too young. Well, there are 3 young ladies that have radically changed how I planned for my own end of life. Brittany Maynard took back her life from a brain tumor that was killing her by moving from one state to the next where death with dignity was legal. She was 29 years old. And Nancy Cruzan was in a severe car accident in her early 20s, leaving her in a vegetated state. And her mom and dad had to petition the United States Supreme Court because they knew what Nancy wanted. They just didn't have the documentations to prove it. She was 33 years old. And of course, Terry Schiavo, the young 26-year-old battling an eating disorder, also leaving her in a vegetated state. And the media frenzy that surrounded her end of life not only ended in her death, but a family battling on opposite sides. I remember Terry's death well because we got a flood of calls, and all we would hear is not even hello, but just, hey, what do I need to, that Terry thing, what do we need to do? Because what do I need to sign? Because I do not want to put my family or myself through that. And yet, as Terry's death was tragic, yes, but man, what a life lesson she taught us. Because if she would have had the documentation that supported the conversation that she had with her husband, maybe her end of life wouldn't have been a media circus. And maybe that family would still be a family. You and I can change this. We can start talking about the elephant in the room. We can get documentations in place that support our end-of-life wishes, and we need to include our healthcare providers. Let's make some waves, people, by reclaiming our voice. Let's radically change how our community faces end of life by doing one thing, by actively participating in your own end-of-life planning. Isn't it time that we accept Eddie, please? Isn't it? Can we acknowledge that he's been in the room with us all along? And shouldn't our ending be just as beautiful and joyous as our beginning? I know it's scary. I feel it from you. But I'm telling you, after 17 years working in the death and dying industry, you do not want to know how scarier it can get if you wind up in our healthcare system without advanced care planning. Every morning I want you to wake up, and let's say tomorrow, I want you to wake up, and when you're lying in your bed, I want you to imagine that you're dying. Because you are. We all are. But when your feet hit the floor, I want you to realize what a gift that is. What are you going to do with that gift? So 2 things I would like you to agree with me on today. That we are all going to face end of life one day, right? We all will. And if we plan and document, we could have an impact on how and where we die. And if you believe these 2 things, then I'm going to ask you the same question that hospice patient asked me so many years ago. What are you waiting for? Thank you.